First, let me thank you all for the invitation to come and speak. This is a great honor. I'm very pleased to be here and very pleased that there's interest in the subject. I wanted to maybe first start by saying that I find myself very surprised to be here in the sense that when I was growing up, I often looked at businesses as the cause of a number of problems, largely pollution, I suppose. And I went into journalism when I was younger with the view that if we could just tell the people, what's going on, we could get businesses to do the right thing. And somewhere along that journey, my mind changed. And I thought, instead of trying to tell businesses what to do, why not set up our own businesses and do it properly? But nevertheless, to kind of be promoting green business, I find a bit of a contradiction. And hopefully I can explain that a little bit more. The company that I'm now running, One Earth Innovation, is an eco-incubator, and I've been doing it now for about 16, 17 years. And one of the things I'll be talking to are really what are the lessons that I've learned over that time that might help those in this audience and other entrepreneurs, whether they're social entrepreneurs or eco-entrepreneurs, what are the lessons that can help them succeed? So I'll come to that actually the last third of this presentation. The second thing I will come to is, how do you make a green product? What have I learned about how that can be done? And that's been a very interesting journey as well. But what I'm going to start with is, in the French, they say the raison d'etre. Why is it important to be doing this? And many of you will already know that, but I think it's worth revisiting because I think times have changed. I think that certainly 30, 50 years ago in the era of our grandparents, green business might not have resonated. I think that has now changed, and the time has come. So whether you are an environmentalist or you are a business person who only wants to profit, a green business is smart. I'm going to start that story by going back to something I learned when I was 14, and in American high school. I'm from Seattle. We were given a petri dish full of what's called agar. It's a gelatin made of seaweed, and we would sprinkle bacteria on it. And the question was, well, will it survive and how fast will it grow? So every day we'd come back and we'd look at the petri dish, and at first not much happened. And then all of a sudden we started to see the splotches that you see now. And it was growing, it was prospering, it was doing well. And a few days into the experiment, we came in and the bacteria had done extremely well. It had covered the entire petri dish. It had won. It was a success story. I assume you all can predict where I'm going with this. 2 days later, we come back into biology class and we look in the petri dish and it's all gone. The bacteria had done so well, it had eaten up all of the resource and then it collapsed. I can guess some of you will predict my next slide. The question is that analogy, that scientific experiment, fair for humans' relationship with the Earth? Some people would argue that it's not, but I actually think it's a very fair analogy, and I think it's an important one. In 1972, the United Nations, through the Club of Rome, published a report called Limits to Growth. And in that report, they tracked 5 different trajectories of the economy. The first part of it was humans. What was population growth? And as you can see here, it's been growing quite rapidly. It's tripled since the end of World War II. This is global population. The other metric was industrial output. How much are businesses needing to produce to provide the things that humans want and need? The third one was pollution. It was rising alongside. The more we produced, the more pollution that was occurring. And simultaneous to that, going the other way, was resources. The more we produced, the less natural resources were available. And it was actually quite precipitous. And the final one is food. As resources were running out and pollution was increasing, they forecast that at some point we're going to reach a peak, and a peak of what the environment can support, and that food will decline dramatically. And the net consequence of all of that, the important one for all of us in this room, is that the population will crash. Now, was this just a lot of anxious conjecture? Well, the sad truth is that this forecast, which is nearly 50 years old now, is being continually updated and proven accurate. And I think the population is one key piece of that. So this issue of the possibility of our great economic success as a planet of entrepreneurs and consumers actually coming to an end, it should be frightening. More frightening is that it's happened throughout history. In Polynesia, or Polynesian sailors years ago had a small handful had landed on an island in the South Pacific called Rapa Nui. The English call it Easter Island. And when they landed there, it was a tropical paradise. It had enormous trees. It was a beautiful jungle island. And for 400 years, this small band of sailors and the people that landed there prospered. And the population grew over a couple hundred years to 20,000. But in that time, the settlers had began chopping down trees to build fishing boats. And they also began chopping down trees to move those giant head sculptures that we've all seen for cultural purposes. The problem was that eventually they chopped down all the trees. And when that happened, they could no longer build more fishing boats, and they could no longer, and without trees, the soil began to erode. So farming started to decline. And what this all led to ultimately was starvation. And when that happened, the population dropped by 90%. By the time European sailors had landed there, the population was under 2,000. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale. And now we can look at those symbols and think of them maybe a little differently. Is it what could happen to all of us in our modern economy? The Stockholm Resilience Institute has asked that question, and they've measured, or they've suggested that we look at 12 key factors that could lead to the ecological collapse on Earth that underpins our economy and human existence. And you can see in red, in some of these, we're already pushing the boundary or exceeding it. So it's a very serious conversation. One analogy that helps paint this picture slightly differently came out in the World Sustainable Summit in Johannesburg, I believe it was, where they asked the question, if everyone on Earth lived like the average American, how much natural resources would be required? And the conclusion was quite startling. 5 Earths, which obviously we don't have. So obviously one lesson is Americans need to stop consuming so much. But the bigger problem is that the rest of the world also want a good standard of living. Who doesn't want that? And what are the consequences of this happening? Well, I think the previous slides illustrate that. So that's all the bad news. The good news is, in my view, there is a way out of this. And the short version of it is eco-innovation. That the funny thing is, I don't think it's government. I think government has a big role to play, and I think government helping groups like us get together is a part of that, certainly. But the people that can change this dynamic are businesses and business people. If we can invent ways of providing the lifestyle that we would like without trashing the planet, well, then that's got to be the goal. And I've got I suppose my favorite example of this wasn't set up by an environmentalist or an eco-entrepreneur. It was just a regular entrepreneur. But his one company is achieving, in my view, more than all the environmental groups combined have achieved. And he's doing it through brilliant innovation. And so most of you may have heard of it, Tesla. But in addition to his cars, he's building solar panels for the entire roof with tiles. He is building solar or battery packs that would fit on every house, which will mean every house can get off of the grid, no more coal, no more central electricity, and there will be excess electricity to run all of our transport. Wow. The auto industry, who you would think would have done this, they weren't paying attention or they didn't care. And I think that's why this group of people, or eco-entrepreneurs, are critical. I think we can't leave it. We can't rely on existing businesses to give up their incredible financial powerhouse companies to make the changes. We do need disruption, and that's why I think innovation is a key aspect of this. So I'm now going to go back to those planetary boundaries, but I'm going to talk about them in terms of opportunities. I believe that, I don't think that's happening today, but I believe if I was teaching business school, this would be the first thing I would have students look at. What are the areas that are going to lead to the implosion of the environment? What can we do to solve it? And what businesses can we build to deliver that? Or what existing businesses can we improve so we're not having a negative impact? And I'll go back to Tesla. I don't think Tesla in the 1970s may have done that well. But 30, 40 years on, the majority of the public in our generation is beginning to be aware that something is wrong. I think climate change has been a big piece of that. Before Al Gore's climate change film, I'm not sure Tesla would have done well. Now, everyone wants one. Everyone wants to not be part of that problem. And I think every one of these issues, if properly communicated, could achieve that same support from the public. In other words, green business could be highly profitable, highly successful business. So I'm going to run through these. I'll try to be fairly quick. I won't dwell on climate change. I think we've all heard about that. But the other items on that list, I believe, have the potential to have as much profile and be as successful for those dealing with them. And I'm going to talk about a project that we ran with Blue Water when we asked the question, well, how can we sell water in good conscience if we're environmentally minded and be contributing to climate change? So we worked on reducing our carbon footprint as much as we could and then offsetting the remainder. But in doing so, we became the lowest carbon drinks company in the market. And we decided to create a little logo that represented that, and we humanized it. I'll talk about why we did that in the marketing section. But the potential for doing good work and then promoting that as a new USP or unique selling point to a market that's interested in it can actually be very useful in business, and it really drove our sales. So it was good for the environment, it was good for our bottom line. Moving on to the other items, ocean acidification. Most of you probably haven't heard much about this. It's caused by the same thing that causes climate change. It's more CO2 is absorbed into the ocean, it's changing the pH of the ocean, and it's affecting marine life. It's another angle, it's another issue that can be used to engage the public and differentiate your company. Most people in the world are now living in cities, and air pollution, as we all know, is a major factor. How many companies right now can we think of that are making this a central part of their communication campaign? I can't think of any. So why not? It's a huge issue, huge opportunity. Maybe somebody will get there one day. Ozone we have heard about, and this actually was an area where the government stepped in. I think it was the Montreal Protocol and cut out CFCs and has had a huge impact. But it's not the issue has not entirely gone away. So it's again an area where businesses could step up and do something and benefit the environment and their business. Fertilizers are one of the items that the Stockholm Resilience Institute says is actually at that critical point. There's two big factors here. One is the nitrogen runoff is creating dead zones in the sea and killing huge numbers of fish and marine life. The other is that phosphorus is one of the three main fertilizers, and the known phosphorus reserves are forecast to run out this century. And if that happens, if we don't find more reserves or find alternative ways of agriculture, that alone will cause the collapse of food supplies that is forecast. So here's an opportunity for innovation. Chemicals, a personal bugbear. There are 90,000 man-made chemicals now on the market. Of these, according to the American Center for Disease Control, only 5,000 have been tested for neurotoxicity or carcinogens. And of those 5,000, 40% 2,000 of them have shown to be neurotoxins or carcinogens. So if you extrapolate out, there are 85,000 chemicals, 40% of which arguably are going to be really bad for us, and yet they're on the market. Well, what can we do about that? Here's a company that has done something about it and is now, a multi-100-pound or $100 million business method. They just simply went to a category and said, we're just going to avoid all of these unknown chemicals and use natural materials. When you walk into the supermarket, that philosophy could be done with every product on the shelf. It's fairly simple. Water, we all understand the issues here. The United Nations forecast that by the middle of the century, so we're not far off of that we will run out, the planet will run out of excess capacity fresh water. So again, a huge barrier, but a huge opportunity for low water intensive manufacturing and business models. In our case, this is the drinks company that I set up in the UK. And just to talk about the marketing for a second, we committed to use our profits to fund clean water projects, and our sales shot up. The public is aware of this. They don't know what to do about it, but any company stepping up and saying, I'm not saying, and actually I don't even know if giving all one's profits away is the best way of running a business. It has some big deficits. But it did prove that the market is very open and supportive of this type of thinking. Land use, briefly, is urbanization and the sprawl of building onto land and topsoil runoff. That is as big of an ecological risk as the fertilizer issue. If the topsoil goes, so goes agriculture, or modern agriculture anyway. And I'm coming back to this slide for a reason. The area that has the biggest red blotch, which is obviously a warning sign, is biodiversity loss, and as in the number of species that are running out. It is expected that that in the lifetime of a child born today, by the time they die, half the species on the planet will also have died. That's profound. So a child born today, by the time they're old, half the species will be gone. We don't want to be one of them, but it's quite sad that that's the legacy of our economy. And more than sad, it should be a warning sign and maybe a war cry to do something about it. I'm sorry for getting up and sounding like a green hippie. I am one, but we'll get to business in a second. Lastly, everyone can appreciate resources. If we run out of resources, whatever business sector we're in, our business ends. The good news on resources, and we've had quite a few people talking about it, and quite a few entrepreneurs here, working on the circular economy model, the cradle to cradle. So there is no waste. We use waste to make more things. And so I feel this is one area where actually businesses is rallying and doing a lot. But there's plenty more, obviously, to be done. So in the center of this slide, I have that atom diagram that says eco-insight. That, in my mind, represents all of those previous slides. If business schools made sure that every student coming out knew all of that, then when they stepped into whatever business they're setting up, they would be, they'd be like a piano. They could play any tune on the piano. They would have all of the information they needed to say, okay, so how do we green this company? And this, to me, is that question. How do we create the greenest possible companies? Well, the starting point is to have that knowledge set of where are the key areas. It might be a little boring to some, but I believe it is essential. But then the fun part starts. Now that we know what we have to solve, now we ask the question within our business, and I've created a simple life cycle diagram, starting with, well, why do we need the product in the first place? How could we design it in a more intelligent way? What materials we're using? What's the manufacturing process? How do we cut out waste, cut out energy consumption? How do we reduce logistics and, again, transport? Big one is staff and culture. A lot of people in companies this hasn't been a priority, but if they realized it was a priority and if management was listening to their creative ideas, who knows what great ideas could come out from the community in the office? Accounting, massive. We don't account for the environment in our businesses. It's not even legally required. Shocking. because the true cost is that a lot of businesses that seem profitable, if you actually included what it's doing to the long-term balance sheet of the planet, might not be. So that's a great opportunity for kind of inventing new business models. Sales and marketing is also huge. One of the soap industry, I think Unilever, Procter & Gamble, when they did a life cycle assessment, the initial assumption was, well, what are we using chemicals that aren't good for consumers? What's our packaging like? But they actually, when they looked at the usage of their product, the biggest impact for certainly the shampoo companies was the time that people were in the shower, the energy and the heat of heating that water. So it's just kind of surprising to them, it's surprising to me. And so thinking about how customers use our product, reuse them, and ultimately at the end of that journey is the circular part. And can we get the products back? How can we repurpose them? So that combination of really paying attention to the life cycle of your business and really paying attention to the environmental issues that I talked about. And beyond that, I can give no advice. This is down to investigation, and it's down to creativity and research. And every business has an opportunity to do this. Hopefully the starting part of this gives the motivation. There's a great opportunity here. So I'm going to park that. Let's see how time I'm doing. I'm about halfway through. The green innovation is the section we've covered. I'm going to move on to equally important issues. So what good is it to make a green product if no one buys it? It could be the greenest product, but if people don't want it, we're not going to have the impact that's needed. So finding ways of, I call it blue marketing, not green marketing, and I'll explain why in a second. Green doesn't always sell. And the reason for that, and this is data that comes from a study of consumers in the United Kingdom, but I think it's largely applicable internationally. I'm sure there's variations in different parts of the world. And in the study, they looked at ethical consumption and sustainable consumption. I call it just green, I've summarized that as dark green consumers being 4%, light green consumers being 16%, so together about 20%. And that actually, for some industries, is all you need. You could have a great business if you had 20% of the market, wonderful. But we're not going to have the change that's needed if we don't get the majority. And of course, every company wants to get the majority. And I call these consumers blue consumers. They do care about the environment, but they also care about the price and quality of a product. They're not going to sacrifice much, and they're not going to pay too much more. They're not going to take a product they don't really like. So actually, the starting point on marketing to them is making sure your product is really good. And I'm going to give you I'm going to walk you through the thought process of how we did that with Blue Water, and again in the thought process of a new product we're about to launch, just to give you a sense of how that plays out. But before getting there, I'm just going to back up to some basic psychology. When they look back at the evolution of the human brain, our earliest ancestors were reptiles, and we had a very small brain stem that was where our instincts reside: fight or flight, hunger, survival. It's still with us, and it's a very powerful part of our thinking. As our ancestors evolved into mammals, so cats and dogs, we created a limbic system, a slightly larger part around the brainstem. And those species lived in groups. They were emotional, group survival was important. So what people thought of them, and empathy towards others was a very powerful part of that. And that, in my simple model here, as you know, it's more complicated in reality, is where the emotions lie. Sadly for environmental businesses, the part of the brain that deals with abstract thought, like in 100 years we might run out of clean water, or sooner than that, is the neocortex. But it's the least persuasive of our innate thought processes. So the simple kind of metaphor that looking at this the way it's shaped my thinking is that the more abstract green thinking we can move from that thought part of our brain into the emotional, the more successful we will be. If we can make it an instinctive and emotional decision, we'll do better. So how did we do it with blue water? And I'll show you this, my prop. I'll explain this bottle in a second. What we made sure we did is that in our brand thinking, our design thinking, and so forth, we always were paying attention that the quality aspects and the price aspects of the product were being given as much attention as our eco agenda, which sometimes seems counterintuitive. People think, oh, a green product, you'll notice that we didn't, well, I'll show you a slide in a second. We didn't put a picture of the earth on the product. How many people want to drink a bottle that says Greenpeace? Not a lot. This is a long conversation, but I'll summarize it. We then said, well, what does quality look like? Price is pretty easy to understand. Sometimes green products can be cheaper, sometimes more expensive. But quality is one you have to pay a lot of attention to. So we looked at the performance, the style of the design, appearance. In our case, we went to every mineral well in the UK, over 70. So we had a really interesting story to tell about the product. And importantly, we also got some excellent design work. And there's one diamond at the bottom called status. Now, status is a big part of why we buy things. The professional marketers know this well. It's why we buy a lot of things. And if we can make our green products high status, well, that's a great way of getting people to support what you're doing. Just because I found this an interesting slide, what we then asked was, well, how does that manifest? How do we actually put that thinking into practice? And we created in the left-hand column a list of the main communication channels. So what's the name of the product? What are the colors we're using? What's the text that we're putting on the packaging? And then, well, what information do we put on the website? And what information do we put in our press release? So created a list of all the communication messaging. And then we created a grid and said, well, we have to make sure we cover everything. For blue consumers, we need to cover what they want to see. And for green consumers, who, by the way, the media likes the big issues. So they don't care if you have a beautiful bottle that much. But if you're taking on a big issue, that's pretty interesting for them. So we divided up our messaging. There's not one way to do this, but at least make sure you're covering all your bases. And thinking about the reptile in us, if you get a bottle of water, you want it to quench your thirst. You want it to make you feel good. So having some of those instinctive messages on the packaging made sense to us. And this is the first product we launched. It was a glass bottle, and we had gone not only to all the water sources to find the purest one we could find, but we went to the top design house in London, and they created we won numerous design awards, and it really did show off a product that even if we weren't green, we would sell. And that was, I think, kind of the standard you want to work to. Don't rely on the green, do all the extra work as well and then you have a really overwhelming proposition. Now, having done that, kind of really focused on the reptile and mammal decision-making part of our customers' minds, then we had time to focus on the environmental innovation, which is why I was really interested in it. The first thing we did, I'll have to be quick here, was we launched the glass bottles because it was easy to get to market with, and we wanted time to find a way of making a plastic bottle that wasn't polluting. And with that time, we began looking at bioplastics. And it was early in the evolution of bioplastic. There's a lot more going on now. But at the time, we came across a supplier who was making polylactic acid, which is plastic made from corn sugar, can also be made from other cellulosic plants. And the problem was it was yellow. And so it took us a good 6 months of finding a way, and we didn't think we could sell bottled water in a yellow bottle. It wasn't going to be marketable. And so there was quite a bit of getting things sorted. But when we finally did get it to market, it was extraordinary. People who didn't care about or didn't know about all the environmental issues were just not just surprised, but excited. Really, you've made a plastic bottle out of corn? It caught people's imagination so much that we got front page newspaper coverage, which you couldn't pay for. We had the internet, which was now coming along nicely at the time, went alive internationally with conversations about it. And I leave that as another opportunity. So while it may take extra time to invent a green product, you can make that back in the low-cost marketing opportunities that come from it. So again, it's smart business. Other things that we did, I mentioned the penguin approved earlier about climate change. But just briefly on that, trying to market the climate change, it's fairly abstract. But we thought, how can we get that message across in a way that's going to be emotional? And we thought, well, climate's going to melt the Arctic, and that could affect the polar bears and the penguins. Which one should we use? Let's go with penguins. And we found that actually was very effective. People could think about it in an emotional way. And again, we think it had more traction than talking about particulates and amount of carbon in the air. And lastly, we've discovered to our chagrin one day that our water didn't smell very good at the factory. So we went back up and looked at all the options, and we discovered that the bottle cap manufacturer for our glass bottles was putting in a little rubber liner, but they were using polyvinyl chloride, which is PVC, which includes chemical phthalates that are softeners. And these phthalates are actually endocrine disruptors, which affect the formation of children's, it affects their health of pregnant women and young children. Well, quickly we went back and found an alternative supplier. And then we tested all of our competitors, and what did we find? That more than half also had this very same problem. We felt the media thought might find this interesting, so we shared our research with them, and we got, again, national media coverage of a scandal that in an industry that prides itself in providing nothing added, the one thing they were adding was something that no one should be consuming whatsoever. And again, the green R&D turned out to be a massive marketing opportunity and brought in a huge number of additional consumers. Now, one other thing I should add to the marketing. So we've covered, you want to appeal to the blue consumers with quality. There's huge benefit in green R&D delivering marketing. But another, and this I can't take credit for this idea of leveraging social dynamics, where the first time I came across it was reading Malcolm Gladwell's book Tipping Point. And he made some really good kind of insights. Most of you are aware of these probably, but if you find opinion formers, they will shape the views of others. We do this all the time. We talk to our doctor to get medical advice. We don't talk to our mechanic. So in the case of whatever industry you're in, if you find those early adopters who can appreciate what you're doing, they will spread the news. And how we saw that, and in the case of an eco product, it's pretty easy to find the people that are interested in that, and they will tell others. But one thing that I found very powerful is that while they are greens, they are also rebellious. There's something rebellious about saying, even Elon Musk, there's a bit of pride in saying the whole auto industry has spent 100 years saying electric cars aren't going to go very far, and they don't look very good, and they're not very powerful. And he's rebelled against that, and a lot of consumers are wanting to join that rebellion. And if you look at green not just as saving the planet, but in a way rebelling against an industry who've been ignoring issues that really they should have been paying attention to, there's a bit of an opportunity for getting more and more people. So again, from a marketing point of view, being smart on how you position your product and engage people in your journey, your battle, is a very powerful way of getting more markets and more consumer support. Now I'm going to turn to the latest project that I'm working on, and I'm going to walk you through kind of how all the lessons that I've learned thus far are going to be, how we're going to try to implement them on this. So I don't know if they'll work, but at least you can see how that might work. The logo for our we're launching a line of denim jeans, and on the back pocket of jeans, I think we all know the Levi's has a patch. It's the industry standard. And the patch we've designed, we've put a comet coming towards Earth. And obviously that's our symbolic way of referring to the limits to growth forecast, that if we don't change, we might end up like the dinosaurs after the comet. But again, that's not necessarily an emotional, thank you. That might kind of make people pay attention for a moment, might make them laugh, might make them scared, might make people not like us, I don't know. But what else are we going to do? Where's the emotional and instinctive connection? So the first thing is to identify the problem. And on this, I'm going to refer to Steve Jobs and Apple. One of his key kind of strategies is when he was looking at his products that he brought to market was to always find an enemy. And in his case, it was the boring IBM, and I apologize to the PC owners, but Microsoft and IBM, they weren't fun, they weren't user-friendly, they weren't intuitive, and so he always had them as somebody he could be fighting against. In our case, we don't have to look far. The cotton industry, which is what most jeans are made of, I should actually back up. The textile industry in general is the most polluting industry after the oil industry. So there's a big problem. And within textiles, the biggest polluter is cotton. So we're going into a market which is one of the biggest markets that needs to be addressed. And yet, before I got involved in this, I didn't know much about it. I'm assuming most consumers aren't aware that cotton is a massive problem. But again, that's eco-warrior talk. Some people will be interested in it, but we need to engage people on other levels. Well, so in investigating our product, when I looked at our whole life cycle of where our product comes from, how do we manufacture it, what alternatives, one of the things that we discovered was that the original jeans, in fact, where the word jeans comes from, was from Italy. And in the 12th century, the Genoese were one of the biggest navies in the world, and they made their giant canvas sails out of canvas, or they called it canapé. In Chinese, it's called ma, English hemp. And the reason they used it is it's twice as durable as cotton, and it doesn't rot in seawater. But eventually the sails would get worn, and the sailors would cut up the sails and make trousers. And so they would sail around the Mediterranean, and when they got to France, the French would say, they didn't say Genoa like the Italians, they said jean. So that's where the original concept for jeans came from. Although I think, to be fair, the Chinese have been using this material, ma, to make fabric for 10,000 years. So you might not call them jeans, but I think that the Chinese have just as good a claim to this material. And this story, however, is really important because the current marketing around denim jeans comes from my country. The biggest brand is Levi's, and it's marketed around the cowboys. And then it was the miners, and then it was the motorcyclists. But actually, the original jeans, in terms of the popular use of the term, comes not from cotton denim, but actually from hemp fabric. So we have another story that we can pull on and engage people. My graphics didn't quite come out as planned, but if you look at the photo, the other advantage is they're twice as tough. And in the denim market, being tough is a huge factor. So we actually have that to engage people on, and therefore arguably more cost effective. So, and then last but not least, like all clothing companies, we need to be stylish. We need to have a good looking product. So we put a lot of effort and time into that. We're not just relying on being sustainable. But of course, we are going to be the most sustainable. So hopefully that combination of having quite a few benefits on the product aside from the environmental, and then also having the most powerful environmental story will give us a really strong place to get into the market and disrupt it. And then finally, and I go back to that blue marketing, we're absolutely going to be we're rebelling against, I say entrenched, but the incumbent business, but with a really interesting story, and we hope to gauge people's sense of enjoying fighting back to join us. My time is up, so I'll have to kind of end here, but we're always welcome. We hope to bring our product to Taiwan as one of the first markets we go to, and we may even want to do some manufacturing here. So if there's anyone in the audience who would be open to helping us, my email is there. We'd love to talk to you. Thank you very much. 谢谢。